My name is John Tures, LaGarnge College. My views are my own, and I'm here to talk about terrorism, conflict, and possibly religion.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John and Pete.
What a show. So John is up in Northern California. I'm handling the hosting duties, and this is more of my wheelhouse anyhow. So another show about conflict. That's what Pete does. I apologize to all you guys, but I know you're going to be interested in what John has to say, especially timely because the UK Guardian released a story about lone wolf terror, and is that the right moniker for that kind of fight? There's a complex attack in Russia today with people that one of our favorite correspondents here is Dr. Tim Furnish, who's also from Georgia area, and he likes to call them Islamic literalists. And since he has a license to say that, that's what I say, Islamic literalists. So we've got John here to talk about a whole variety of things. So buckle up. Here we go. Welcome to the Break It Down Show, John. I really appreciate you.
Thanks, Pete, for having me on.
John and I met at a conference, the Southern Political Science Conference in New Orleans back January. I chaired a panel for which he and his students had written a paper, and they actually bullseyed the target, the lone wolf moniker and what it means. Can you give us a real quick brief synopsis of what you guys found for your paper and how it ties into this Guardian article?
Okay. What happened is started a research project on lone wolf terrorism, and of course we had subsequently many attacks before that. But we started the project in 2015, and we looked at data from 2013 through 2015 on lone wolf terrorists. And the reason we chose those dates is because previous research had looked at the problem up until 2012, and of course we found a lot of new cases that hadn't been looked at. And we decided to look at breaking them down by a series of characteristics. Most of them had been looked at by other pieces of literature. I guess the biggest finding was that 88.5% of all terror attacks were dubbed a lone wolf case. But in reality, only 48.1% of these attacks were actually a lone wolf, one solitary attacker.
And that's the vast majority of the time. And I guess if we were to take out the numbers, and I don't know if you have the numbers in front of you there, if we were to take the other 15% that actually were lone wolves, we're not talking very many attacks overall, are we?
Let's see. We're not looking at a very large number of cases in the terror attacks. I mean, it's not like a huge number. You know, we certainly average one or two a month. For example, research from 1990 through 2012 found 119 lone wolf cases. But what we found is a lot of times even these cases that are lone wolf cases, the 119, many of them involve more than one attacker. They're rarely an actual solitary person.
Okay. So there's some kind of support of some kind, even if they are more alone in nature. Okay. So as you look at the lone wolf situation and we're trying to figure out how to defeat or curtail the attacks, is focusing on the lone wolf then the wrong measure, or are the tools that we're using going to work for a lone wolf as well as an organization, I guess is what I'm asking you.
Sure. That's a very good question. I think what happens when we say lone wolf, not only that, but it implies something that's very difficult to stop. And you'll see that as a recurring theme in the literature, saying, well, this is a lone wolf attack. It's so random. There's no way we can stop this sort of thing. So it almost sounds like we're waving the white flag already. We'll just have to tolerate these. When instead, it sounds like, with a smaller network, it's not impossible to penetrate, and there's actually probably going to be more of a paper trail.
The groups that actively send out terrorists to go act nefariously on their behalf, are those always direct connected, kind of like the IRA model, or is this where there's a proxy in between, say, the organization like Boko Haram or ISIS, and I'm just using really general big groups? Does ISIS have a mechanism for saying, this is what we want you to do if you support us, regardless of where you are? And does that person appear to be a lone wolf when, in fact, they're following the guidance of a larger non-state actor?
Okay. No, it's a very good question. To answer one of your earlier questions, we found 15 cases of freelance terrorism in 2013, 21 in 2014. and 15 in 2015. Now, what we tend to find is a lot of times, a person commits the terror act, that is, in some cases, it's actually the first time the person has committed any sort of crime. But in most cases, it's not like the person loudly declared that they are an ISIS person or went online to declare that they are, probably because they would be caught if they were, or somebody would be monitoring that. So
Right.
A lot of times what happens is the person commits the crime. Yeah, we found actually in 43% of cases, the person who commits the terrorist act, that's their first crime that they've ever committed. So in other words, 57% of the time, yeah, they actually have committed a crime. But what happens is they'll commit the crime of terrorism, and then it's up to the group to claim, oh yes, this is one of ours, even if we can't provide a paper trail where they've gone to Pakistan for special training or Yemen or someplace like that.
Right. So is the group lying when they say that this quote unquote lone wolf has acted on their behalf?
Yeah, I would. That's a pretty good characterization. I mean, because there's not a direct link to them. It's almost like somebody trying to take false credit for something. It makes ISIS seem a lot stronger or more powerful, saying like, "Wow, our reach is nearly infinite." In most cases, you don't have someone flying over to the Middle East and getting direct instructions, even over the internet.
Right. Okay.
That would be one more way for us to track them, of course.
Right. Yeah. If we were to think like the enemy, if we wanted to have a non-centralized action arm, we would want to reduce the amount of ties back to the mothership anyhow. I mean, if a person is successfully tied to ISIS, that now creates analysis and potentially operations to counteract whatever ISIS, Boko Haram, whoever the group is. So they would, in theory, want to build something that was harder to see, harder to perceive if there was a link there, if there even is a pre-existing link. It could be that this person who is exploitable. Okay, yeah, let me ask you, I'm kind of fishing because it's such a fascinating thing.
Oh, yeah.
These people that go out and do things, are these exploitable people that are vulnerable? Because I guess the model that we've all kind of been taught is that these are people that have nothing.
Yes. We tried to look at whether significant changes would have happened before. By the way, to get back to your earlier point, we found that 48% of people had no group membership, 23% claimed some sort of tie to a Middle Eastern group, 27% to a right-wing group, and 2% to a left-wing group. So yeah, about half of them, no affiliation whatsoever with anyone. In terms of exploitable behaviors, we looked at a series of changes that a person could experience and which ones are the triggers. We found that nearly half had at least a brush with the law, if not a criminal record. Very little in a religion change, which is what we thought we'd see, or a family change. About 42% had a location change, but the biggest one that we saw as a pre-event behavior was job status change. Being fired, being laid off, or something like that.
So they've likely
and very little about a school change.
Right. So they likely had this life-defining negative moment where maybe they had things to lose, but now it's like, well, this job, this other life instability has happened. I may as well go ahead and do this thing. They've reached their falling down moment where they've taken all they can stand and they can't stand no more.
Ooh, that's a good analogy. You're referring to the Michael Douglas movie
Yes.
in 1993?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I can see that. You have 58% of the freelance terrorists are also single and 11% are divorced in our survey. So that means only 31% are married. So yeah, closer to the falling down moment as well.
Right. Yeah. See, these are people that become islands, and that makes them exploitable either for their own interest, or they're fed up, or if there is a nefarious actor pulling the strings or whatever.
Yeah. We thought that most of them would be pretty young people, but we actually found that a little more than a third were over 45 years old too. So I mean, just like Michael Douglas's character, falling down moment for males.
So yeah, so we do have young, inexperienced people that maybe are impressionable, but we also have people that have just reached the end of their rope and are more homicidal than suicidal kind of thing. Is that what you're saying?
Oh yeah.
Wow.
Oh yeah, and when you say homicidal, you are exactly correct in the sense of only about a third targeted property, whereas 3/4 targeted people. And they've identified a target beforehand, so it's not like random, some sort of random thing. They had kind of cased the joint for a while. They had planned what they were going to do in a majority of cases. But yes, going after people to kill rather than buildings to blow up.
I want you to say that part again. So are they pre-planning their target, or are these targets of opportunity where they've snapped or they're in some post-snap moment and they say, this is the time?
Yeah, 60% of the time they had planned an attack, and in 72.5% of the time they had identified who their target was going to be beforehand.
Specific target or a location target?
A people target.
Okay. So
which, that's why we think back to that couple in San Bernardino where they identified a Christmas party, a place where the guy had worked at. And right. So, they have been planning this for months. And it does, if you think about it, it does seem very odd because, if you're going to be an ISIS, attack, who goes after a Christmas party of 100 people? You would have thought, go after LAX, or,
right.
Blow up a plane, blow up a bridge, try and, just shoot up a mall or something like that. But this seemed very visceral, very personal for people at work.
It did have a very visceral and personal approach to it. And I'm glad that you brought up the LAX attack, because LAX is constantly working on trying to improve its support structure. And, like all at major airports, they're constantly dealing with, they have to provide access, meanwhile denying access to the people they don't want. And who are those people? So modern attack. So I'm really big on modern conflict, and we use the terms third and fourth generation warfare on my end of the world, where we're talking about warriors going out and doing things. And there's sort of this thought of fifth generation warfare, but I kind of want to get away from that and just talk about modern conflict, because state on state war is not obsolete, but war has really been disrupted. A small element can bring a lot of chaos to a much larger military. A drone, we have drones. So does anybody who goes to Amazon with a credit card, and you can weaponize that drone very, very simply and create a lot of chaos by doing little pinprick attacks. Can you imagine if a lone wolf attacker or a small non-state group was to target Starbucks and just say, hey, I want you guys to go out and just do these little pinprick attacks. And when I say pinprick, they're grisly and horrible at the Starbucks. But imagine what happens to normal life if going to Starbucks now all of a sudden becomes terrible. Or how about DC sniper team? Those guys were out there. They made getting gas terrifying. I actually was in DC in between deployments, and I was using all of my counter sniper techniques, even though I wasn't in this immediate area where they had been acting. You didn't know. So I was doing my lazy W, walking around while I got gas, trying to keep something between me and other lines of sight. So if these... Yeah, go ahead.
That happened not long after we moved from Washington, D.C. down to here. And an FBI agent was shot outside the Michaels, craft store where my wife always frequented. The gas station, I can't remember if it was the one where they shot from or they hit somebody, but there was a gas station we would always go over to Prince William County in Manassas to get cheaper gas. We were there, once or twice a week or so to gas up. And so that was we looked at each other and said, okay, one more reason to move out of Washington, D.C.
Well, yeah, look at that. There's the response. You get these people that are out there doing something that's clearly insane, and people literally leave the area. They change their life. And so if a non-state group had the capacity to leverage even just 5 different people and had them go out and do, can you imagine what happens if they use guns, they use knives, they're using trucks now? So you just drive your truck into a Starbucks.
Get in a truck. And now that's an example where, ISIS obviously isn't directing it, but they send out letters saying, okay, we got to use trucks as suicide weapons. So hijack one and crash it in, like they did in Nice and in Berlin.
Right. And you continue to have this problem of all these groups of people that want to go out and celebrate something, or they're gathered together you think about this. If you want to attack an airport, you don't attack the airplane itself anymore. You just go to the security queue, yell Allah Akbar, push a button. And now travel has totally changed. And that actually happened in Turkey fairly recently, but that's always been, wherever people gather, you have the ability to create a large scale tiny little but large scale imprint on your attack because it creates so much chaos. At some point,
Turkey,
yeah.
Yeah, Turkey's a prime spot for it because their leader is pretty much not only he opened his borders to ISIS and stuff, but he's more interested in doing in political opponents than he is focusing on terrorists. I mean, I'll hear, they had a big crackdown where they caught all these terrorists. It's the leaders of this moderate cleric or something that they don't like. And very few of them are hardened ISIS criminals, and so it's no surprise that, as you point out, the Istanbul airport's attacked. They attacked a nightclub on New Year's. We're going to see a lot more in places where some countries like West Europe and some like, Middle East or East Asia that aren't taking terrorism seriously. That's a very convenient way to kill Americans.
Yeah, it's boy, is that ever convenient. That is a great way to draw a lot of attention to your cause, get a lot of coverage. It's hard to figure out what the end game is for ISIS, and where they go. Because if you get too big, you can't support your own weight, and you draw more attention, and you get into these long, pitched out dry fights, like for Mosul and everything, that have to chew up a lot of resources. But when it comes to the terrorist arms of these things, they really can create a lot of awareness. And I don't know, do you think the goal of ISIS attacks, these little pinprick attacks, is it to find more willing people to sacrifice themselves for the cause or to act for the cause? Is that the point of these things?
I think that's the means. The ends I debate with. There's a religion professor who I have disagreements with. We argue back and forth, and he's convinced that ISIS wants to start some special Middle East caliphate, and this is like a mission from God or something, and that's why they're going on, and that's why they won't stop. My opinion is more that they're like a criminal gang. I mean, the origins go back to al-Zarqawi, and I mean, he got his start by stealing hubcaps in Jordan. I mean, it goes back to making money. This is another way to shake down. This is a way to control oil resources, to bring in money. And if you bring in a transnational network, once you shut down one affiliate in Syria, it can pop up in Libya. It can pop up in Nigeria.
Yeah.
It can pop up in Lebanon, and while people are busy playing whack-a-mole, mm-hmm. The financial networks aren't shut down. I mean, you just shift from the bank accounts from place to place, so no one can quite catch you.
Yeah, it's a difficult problem because I think you're both right. I mean, there is a religious gain that they're looking to do, and that's why we call them Islamic literalists. They're trying to refire up this caliphate. They're trying to hotwire the apocalypse, all of these mm-hmm. things. But you're right. There's absolute financial gains and power to be made from these things. I mean, look at Jaysh al-Mahdi, the power, the political power that group gained by being a lethal group of thugs. It turned out they were actually a political arm, and they were achieving a political ends, and who knows where they end up with. But the point is that this isn't just a fight for God. There's absolutely a money benefit. There's a political benefit. There's a social and cultural part of the fight, and religion is a big piece of it. And that's tough for us as Americans because we see this religion and the state being separate. But for a lot of these folks, especially folks in conflict zones, religion is their stability. And so,
it's the recruiting device because someone is willing to kill themselves for religion. I don't think people are willing to kill themselves for money because you can't spend it afterwards. And so That's used in the recruiting device. But really, if the afterlife is so great, if there are, 70 virgins waiting for you or something like that, the leadership should cash in as soon as possible. But they don't for some reason.
Yeah. And I can see being on the really tough end of things where your family is always struggling and you sacrifice yourself for your family's financial benefit. But, we're talking very limited times that happens. So we have non-state actors trying to create this religious benefit, but also trying to enrich themselves and just improve their people's position. This is largely a social fight. Like, how do we improve this? We're going to take power from the people that have power. We're going to do this by setting up this terrorism arm. We're also going to go out and bully and influence the women and attack them. How does the U.S., what do we do? I mean, you're a smart guy. You got a PhD. You're studying counterterror. How do we deal with this enemy? Because what we've done thus far is maybe it's working and it's such a small, minute attack that we can't really effectively stop all of it. But what do we do? Are we doing a good job?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the best we can do is we can look back at history and what had stopped previous terrorism groups. And one thing I've found, and it's not been presented at a conference yet, but I'm working on it with my students this semester, is to demonstrate that we tend to think that terrorism works as a strategy. We can think of a successful case like the Irgun in Israel or the FLN in Algeria, and we can say terrorism works because the British left Israel and the French left Algeria. And if we go to the Marine barracks bombing, we can say the Americans left, the peacekeeping forces left Beirut. And so people assume that terrorism works in most cases. That's one way they do. They can say, well, look at the results of these cases. The second reason people think it succeeds is we think that, okay, well, terrorism works because they kill people. Terrorism works because they get a lot of hits on the internet. They get a lot of attention and publicity. And while I would admit that, yes, terrorists can kill people and they can get some publicity, it doesn't mean that they accomplish their goals. Bruce Hoffman, who's a leading expert on terrorism, talks about the case of this Armenian terrorist group that hit Turks all over in West Europe and in the United States. You even saw this Armenian Secret Liberation Army of Armenia, which is one of my favorite terror group names, if you had to have a favorite.
Say it again.
It's called like the Armenian Secret Liberation Group for Armenia. Yes. It mentions Armenia twice.
Yeah.
And Hoffman points out that, yes, they killed some Turks or people they didn't like. Yes, they have more publicity, but, you know, by the time the group's power was waning, they were no closer to their goals than when they started. And so, you know, unless your goal is to murder, it doesn't mean that you're going to succeed. I mean, Narodnaya Volya, the Russian terrorist group, they were able to kill Tsar Alexander II, but they couldn't get rid of czars. You know, Tsar Alexander III came in and was far more terrible and cruel to the group. You know, they accomplished less by using terrorism. That needs to be demonstrated. So we need to get out of the mindset that terrorism usually works, or always works. Because it's multiple factors. Even if you looked at the most successful cases, well, the FLN was all killed off and decapitated, and it was a popular uprising that you know, led to the French leaving. But it was, you know, a couple of years later. So we're falsely claiming the FLN alone and their terrorism did them in. And the British, you know, yes, terrorism was used, but the British were starting to decouple from their empire anyway. And Transjordan was a protectorate, not a colony.
Yeah, you're talking also, I guess it depends on the outcome, on whether or not it's a revolution, or is it an insurrection, or is it an insurgency, or whatever. I mean, the French, you know, we all watched the battle for Algiers in our counterinsurgency training, you know, coming in to understand kind of what we were going through. You realize that it's just a mess. And you're not going to know what you were doing until someone tells you 40 years from now what you were doing. Right. So that brings to the point, and one of my very good friends is he has his own show. His name's Jay Moore. He's an actor, comedian, and he always
Jay Moore.
Yeah. He's a good friend. I've been on his show. He's been on our show, and one of the things he keeps asking me is, then why are we fucking with it? Why do we go? Why deal with these things if it is so hard to sort out? If 1/3 of the people are young people, if 1/3 of the people are, I give up 45-year-old, life isn't going my way people, if there are so many variables, why are we dealing with it? Are we really all that unsafe here in the U.S.? Is it worth our time, money, and service members' lives?
Oh, yeah. And not only that, there's a strong view to not giving in to terrorists. I was listening to Madeleine Albright's book, and she's talking about Benjamin Netanyahu, who always took a very hard line on terrorists. When he signed the Wye River Accord, he wanted to make sure that the Palestinians were going to handle Hamas. And then Netanyahu was voted out, and a more liberal general got in, Ehud Barak, and he started making deals with the Syrians and, you know, Hezbollah and withdrawing. He gave the best deals to those who used terrorism against Israel.
Breakdown. John and Pete.
Hey, everybody, if you like the Break It Down show,
I can dig it.
And of course you do.
Of course you do. Hit that subscribe button.
John and Pete.
It helps us out.
Say what?
Hey, if you're going to like the show on Facebook or on Twitter, It helps us out if you share the show so people can learn about it. So liking it is great. Sharing is even better.
Let's do some spy stuff.
Yeah, just
let's
sneak
get
in
all
there.
our friends' phones and have them subscribe to the Break It Down show. Do it. Subscribe. Listen to the show. If you love the show, tell 5 of your friends. Or if you hate the show, tell 5 of your friends.
And so it sent mixed messages to the Palestinians saying, here, we've tried peace for 6 years and we've got nothing. You know, these other groups tried terrorism and they got results from this new leader, you know, with offers to withdraw from most of the Golan Heights, leaving southern Lebanon security zone unilaterally. And so the Palestinians thought, well, we need to go back to terrorism because that's the only thing that got results. And that's why the Oslo Peace Accords fell apart. It was giving into terrorism, thinking that if you do what they want, they'll go away. No, it often emboldens them.
Yeah. It's, it's tough. It really is a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of thing. Because you can absolutely just say, this is minor, insignificant. And it's a horrible thing to say, but when you look at the cost of 9/11, 3,000 people died. Well, we killed 3,000 of our own people, plus trying to stop what happened and inconvenienced a lot of people and sacrificed a lot of civil liberties and spent $1 trillion. And are we any better off? You know,
it's a good point. If you remember as we're talking about St. Petersburg and terrorism this morning, of course, it brings back memories of 2004 and the Madrid train attacks. Well, the new Spanish socialist government they got in, they withdrew everybody from Iraq, and you think, okay, well, that stops terrorism, right? No, there was another wave of terrorism. The only way they stopped the terror attacks in Spain was actually, capturing or killing the terrorists, not doing what the terrorists wanted you to do, because terrorism alone doesn't seem to be a good way to get goals, and they need help from a weak or naive administration.
Yeah, it does take
give them what they want.
Yeah, a weak or naive administration or just multiple administrations back to back. If you're constantly churning over your legislative branch and your executive branch, it's hard to get a unity of effort to make the long-term commitments to doing these things. And again, and here's the damned if you do part again, damned if you don't. If you do have this long-term committed thing, kind of like President Bush is like, this is going to be hard, we're going to start, and then you pass the baton, and oddly enough, President Obama, in a lot of ways, followed the Bush doctrine, a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And are we any better off? Like, we've had this dedicated approach, and maybe we are not having an effect or getting a huge terrorist impact here in the States. But for sure, in Europe, we've got a large population that's causing a lot of problems. Proximity helps, but then also, like, if you don't deal with that, if we turn our backs on it, do we let the wolf into the hen house, and now we have an even bigger problem that causes even greater loss of civil liberties and revenue. It's a very challenging challenge to have to deal with. Can we even draw a line? I mean, how do we decide if we have a good leadership that can take on a problem like this?
You bring up the idea of, when you mention modern conflict, that we're not going to see terrorists, signing a negotiated agreement on the USS Missouri, saying that we're done with terrorism. It usually ends with the leadership decapitation, at the top level.
Yeah.
Usually how terrorism ends.
Literally, yeah.
Oh, yeah. And between states, this notion of sovereignty, the notion of Clausewitzian views on war, it's rarely a total war. It's usually one side capitulates to the other. Even Appomattox Courthouse, Robert E. Lee is signing, articles of surrender, and the country starts to come back together. With terrorists, that's not the case. In fact, many of the guerrilla fighters in the Civil War never surrendered. They just simply disbanded and became people like the James Gang. Or robbing banks as a way to continue the struggle.
They sort of become extra legal. They don't want to come back because that's not what they fought for. And then now they have to survive outside the law and obviously doing illegal things, but not really able to be brought to justice. That's why I call them extra legal. They don't. And oddly enough, the Civil War is from my understanding, is a pretty unique ending to a civil war. Does everybody go, yep, done with this. Let's all just get back together. Like, it's such an odd conclusion to such a grisly and hard fight.
Right. we think of like the terror group, like the Tamil Tigers. How was that solved in Sri Lanka? Well, eventually Sri Lanka, I guess, got good intel on what the top leadership was. They were all together in one area, and the Sinhalese majority government just steamrolled them.
Yeah, yeah. You know what? You go to the wrong cocktail party, and the fight is over. Let's talk a little bit about religion and how it impacts our modern conflict. So, I say this quite often, but I don't think I say it enough because people don't necessarily understand what I'm talking about. Modern conflict, from my point of view, is comprised of 5 elements. And those 5 elements are, obviously, you have to have military might. You have to have that, all right? And lethality comes with that. And I always have to preface this because my military brothers and sisters get upset when I don't. So military is a huge part of it. It is elemental. Social, cultural, political, and then religion. All those things have to be accounted for. They comprise the fight. If you miss one of those things, if you don't have professional level capacity in one of those things, you are not going to advance a modern conflict. Then maybe there's another element that I haven't thought of yet. Maybe there's a Berkeleum that I haven't made in a lab. But those, if you have a mastery of those 5 things, you can move the people in a way that will cause the successful conclusion of your situation most reliably. That's a lot of words. So religion's a big part of what's going on. Not necessarily, and I'm not trying to get into an Islamic literalist kind of argument, but it is important for us to understand that we do have a fight that involves people that are leveraging Islam. And I'm saying that as kindly as I can say. If we refuse to see that, it's not all of Islam. It's not all of it. It's just there are people that use Islam as a means to advance their objectives. So if we don't look at holding Islamic leaders responsible who have these kinds of things, if we don't politically deal with these things, then they're going to keep getting dealt with on our end. We'll keep receiving these things. How do you see religion affecting modern conflict?
I think when it comes to Islam, you might be interested in this as well. I'll see how related they are. Just came back from a conference at Fort Benning. It's on women, peace, and security. And they focused all on the PMESI, by the way, without saying it explicitly. There was a different element to, women and peace and security. But one of the presenters, Dr. Patel from Nova Southeastern University, gave a talk about terrorists and recruiting women. And this is something, a couple of minutes ago I was talking about the biggest change that affects a primarily male-dominated sport of terrorism, and that's the job status change. Your role as breadwinner is compromised, and you have feelings of insecurity that you're unable to provide. You have anger directing at others. When they try to recruit women as terrorists, it's a similar idea, but a different tactic. Over in the Middle East, thanks to a lot of the way Islam is being interpreted, the role of the woman is to be a wife, to provide lots of children, and to be, please the mother-in-law. And when terrorists are trying to get women, because of course you'll remember since you've seen the movie Battle of Algiers, women are less likely to fit the profile. So there's a great interest in having women as suicide attackers.
Right.
And what they do is they tend to look for the women who are the most vulnerable, like those who suffer from postpartum depression, who have miscarried, who have lost a child, who have lost a husband, who have been divorced or been kind of disowned by their family. And ISIS-type groups will come to them and say, well, you're nobody in society. The only way that you have any sort of meaning in society, in our view of Islam, is if you go blow yourself up, which is about as heartless as you can think. I mean, you're preying on people the same way that a cult leader might look for vulnerable people to get new recruits to be brainwashed.
Well, let me jump in here and add some reality and some context to that particular example. And I don't know that this happened, but I certainly don't know that it hasn't. So I knew about a woman that had lost her husband. And I know this the very basics of details, right? I don't even have all of them, but I met this woman. She survived on the most slimmest of margins. Whatever we all have is 1,000 times better than what she had. She was being cared for by her brother-in-law, because that's what you do in Islam. And he had given her a little corner of his property in the back of it. And then there was a ruin of a house, literally 2 walls. And that was it. That was what she had. 2 walls, no roof, nothing. This is not a house. This is not a dwelling. It's a portion of a dwelling. And she had been given, I think, a cow, and she had maybe a chicken, and that was her means of survival. And because she was a quote unquote whore, which who knows what really is going on there, if she's actually using her body for money. And if she did in that situation, you know, the religious part says, hey, we need to help this lady out,
right.
you know, but she was deemed as undesirable and had to go into town, had to leave her very small babies to go and sell the milk that she could get just to make the most meagerest of existence. And she was absolutely her existence drove the brother-in-law just mad. He didn't want her around. She was dirty and caused a harm to his family in that he was harboring this whore and everything else. So it's not hard to know about this person, because you say, hey, who needs help? Who needs help? And so you go out and you find Fatima, and she's in this corner, and you're like, listen, here's what you're going to do. I'm going to make sure your children are taken care of, but you're going to put this bomb on and push a button. You're going to do this because that's the only way that your kids are going to have anything happen. And when she says no, you grab a kid and you take it. And you're like, your kid's never coming back. And then the lady starts to realize she really has no other option. And this is someone that has no options left. She's completely out of control of her life. And she's exploitable, 100%. And it solves everybody's problem. She goes away, so the brother-in-law gets what he wants. You know, the kids are really inconsequential, except for to the mom. Right. And that's how you lever her off of a position she would never choose to go to. But she's out of options. There are no options in front of her that are good. Yeah, so it's that simple. I'm giving this to the audience so they can hear that. Like, it's that simple. It's that close to reality for that person. And then the next part of her life is set. She's going to go and do this thing, and she has no choice.
It's the more that people can reveal about this, because, when I took my students out, they were kind of shocked and going, God, it's like really low, way to recruit somebody is to pretty much marginalize them in society and then say, well, because you're marginalized in society, it's time to do yourself in. Get this. This is something you probably knew, but I didn't know this. Evidently, they have, when a man blows himself up and he's a martyr for the cause, he gets 70 virgins in heaven or whatever. And for a woman, she gets a husband. I mean, even the afterlife, there's sexism.
Yes. There's actually a funny alternate translation, too, for the 72 virgins. It's grapes. Can you imagine if that was the reality? Like, you can get there and you're like, a handful of grapes?
It's like, what? What? Yeah. When I was in the first, I get one, but that's, even
one husband.
Even the afterlife is sexist, so.
Yeah.
It's like, what is my option? When I was over in Turkey, I spent some time with this guy I was mentioning, not this guy, but this guy's group, the moderate Muslim cleric who's being demonized by President Erdogan. Well, anyway, in their group, they had women who would dress like Westerners. They had women who had a headscarf. So there's always like, okay, I'll listen to what the media says Islam is like, and then I'll get to go see for myself. And a lot of times, like the men were engaging us in conversation while the women were preparing the food, and then when it came time to actually eat, the men would serve the food. So it's like there's like these dual roles. The women led the prayers, like they would say all the prayers. The women are the ones who really know how to pull off the prayers better than the men. Yeah. And then afterwards, when we're having coffee and tea, after everyone's been served coffee and tea, everyone jumps in and they were all participating equally. And I don't think that they were just staging it for us. I mean, they were just kind of going standard operating procedure. This is what we do. And we right. stayed in touch with some of the guys and some of the gals. And I mean, anything we see on Facebook or anything about their contacts, this is how they live, and so I think for the overwhelming number of people in Islam, that's what you've got. And you've got a couple people like the Turkish president who exploits Islam for political gain. And you've got groups like ISIS who exploit it to make money. And in the case of the Turkish president, or Bashir al-Assad or somebody, money and politics. And so, the Islam card gets played as a way to trick a lot of people who don't know the deal, who don't know everything about it.
Yeah.
Think about those, you mentioned the DC snipers. I mean, they would fail a test on what Islam really stood for. they couldn't pass it.
Sure, absolutely.
And I actually used this term when this was going on, and students were all like, "Oh my gosh, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think it's someone, some high-level Al Qaeda operatives who are doing it? Do you think it's, some hopped-up religious, cleric, some fundamentalist or so?" And I said, I actually called them in my class poser Muslims before they were ever caught.
Yeah. Right. It's absolutely the case that these guys are never they're not going to send the brightest bulb in the chandelier out to go do this kind of work. They need people that are exploitable, and those people typically don't have a whole lot of options left, or they self-select themselves into that, and they may be brilliant, but they've self-selected themselves into a bad life. Absolutely. You brought up the conference that you went to at Fort Benning, and I'm really big on females in conflict zone because we get wrapped around a lot of things. We have a lot of problems. We create a lot of problems for ourselves. So my writing partner, Dr. Richard Leday, and I wrote a paper on the ethical pitfalls of female empowerment in conflict zones. And even the word empowerment drives people crazy. So I would talk about this paper, and the first question I was give, like, wait, which women? Ours or theirs? Like, well, okay, theirs. But I understand that we are passionate about our females too. So that was like the first eye-opening thing where, like, to define our terms even more so, and then the passion that came back at me about which group I was talking about. And let's be honest, I'm a big white dude talking about female empowerment, and then the word empowerment driving people crazy. We don't need to empower women; they are empowered. Like, oh, okay, calm down. There's not a good word, because your word is not as. I need a all-encompassing kind of word. So we can barely even write and talk about these things. And then what we realize is that commanders have an ethical dilemma. They reach a point of ethical saturation where if ethics are good versus bad, you start to make decisions that are supposed to be good but have horrible results. So you have things like these female teams. There's a thing called a FET, and there's a thing called a CST, and they go out into the villages and they interact with women because they are women. And that sounds great. Like, yeah, they're going to train them and they're going to wear the proper garb and everything else. And that's where the sophistication really kind of stops. And I'm being critical openly of these groups because they struggle to have the proper kind of impact. They focus on things like how many villages they interact with, not what they did well. And then they can't measure internally because, of course, they don't have a problem. They're very good at what they do, except for when you put the external spotlight on and you look at how we engage females in conflict zones and what we are trying to do. So that the commander's got this ethical dilemma where you have to prepare for combat. And if you don't, you are not doing your basic job as a commander. And so you put all of your effort into... If you're a tanker commander, you're working on moving your tank battalion around and teaching your companies and your platoons, your tank platoons, how to maneuver on the battlefield. Keep in mind, there is no tank fight coming, but that is what they have to do. That is the requirement of the job, is to do that. And so then from there, in the tiny bit of time you can carve out your cultural training and your understanding. No one's reading Benedict Grima's book on Pashtun women. Great ethnography to give you an understanding of what's going on. And that's not the how-to book. That's just the beginning of the book to understand, like, wow, we know nothing about this world. You're going to go into it and try to assume to improve the condition of somebody without even knowing their condition now is reckless. It's inappropriate. But we continue to do this. And the military is trying to figure out how to work through these problems. But the thing is we can barely even talk about the problem. And we get so impassioned at the theoretic level. And it's one of the reasons why I like to talk to, PhDs like yourself. So, I can walk into the ivory tower and be like, hey, it's all right in here, and you guys can go like, oh God, thank God you came in from the ground. We have no idea. We want to be better. I mean, this is the point, right? And so we have women. I've literally talked to U.S. women who are impassioned about female rights and everything, and talking about the international charters and the laws. Like, that does not matter to Sher Ali. He doesn't care about that. He will never care about that if you approach him like that. So the next layer is, once you get past the commander's ethos, you have to deal with the male elders, because they are the government. They are the state. And it's I know it's hard to say that, but that's the reality. Who protects these people? Who provides money? Who gets them to the hospital? Who resolves murder? It's not our rule of law, it's their rule of law. And so if you don't deal through the existing power structure, you're corrupting that structure, and that's going to cause chaos and problems and pain and suffering. And then finally, once you've worked through those two groups, once you get the commander to say, yes, we're going to focus more of our attention here, or preferably bring in outside expertise to deal with this female issue, then you can go to the elders and say, we would like to deal with your women. How do we do that effectively? Who is interested in learning more? Who wants education? And that is not a single meeting. That's a multi-month, multi-year process to get the different elements to do it. Because once you start to make changes in the villages, the next village over, the neighbor may undermine what you do and bring conflict in. It's a very delicate, slow work, but that's as fast as this work can be done. And then finally, when you've worked through the elder network, you can slowly start to work into the females that are interested in doing things that are outside of their norm. Because the norm is like you said, you go on and you become a good wife. You take care of the mother-in-law and you have these things and you run a house. And many of the women in Afghanistan, in this case, want that. They want that thing because that's their norm. That's their ideal thing. And then everything else is impossible. And they don't want to leave their family for the rest of their lives. They don't want to put their family in jeopardy because they went to the London School of Economics. They want something different, and we've got to be very careful.
Oh, yeah.
And we just don't see that level of detail. And I wonder if you saw that kind of concern for being deliberate and slow and accurate over here's what we're going to do, because we like to do, but we don't always measure how effective our doing is.
One of the presentations was by a woman who's part of the Colombian peace process, who's in the military. And keep in mind, this is a WHINSEC person, Western Hemisphere International Security. And she pointed out, she was even saying how the role that women can play, it's like, okay, well, it's not going to be a 50-50 gender balance, obviously. And she said there are a couple of things that we could do that the men can't. But there was, to kind of appease the population, there was a quota system put in for like how many women would be involved in this. And she told of a situation where there was an opening, and she refused to have it filled by a female because, as she put it, none of the women were qualified. And I don't want to undermine this whole thing, because if we put someone in just to appease a political quota, it's not going to work. And not only that, people won't have women in where they really are needed, because, some of the FARC and some of the ELN, the Colombian guerrillas, would use women. And so if it's an only male solution, that's one thing. And second, one of the reasons why FARC and ELN could get women in is they could say, well, look, this is the only place for a woman to make a difference. And so if you say, well, we have women who make a difference here too. One other thing that they would have to overcome is sometimes we always think of this as a male versus female issue. And I was telling my class, a class where we look at gender roles and American experience, I was telling them that Tennessee was the state that finally ratified the 19th Amendment that put women over the top, and every state after that point could get the right to vote. It became a constitutional amendment.
Right.
The battle was between women who wore the yellow or white rose to indicate that they wanted the right to vote, versus the women who wore red roses who did not want women to have the right to vote. It was women versus women, because there's a view of women who were saying, no, our traditional role is to stay out of politics. That's a man's world, and that's dirty business, and you shouldn't be into that. And you had women who were like, no, we deserve an equal say, and this is how we're going to get anything accomplished, and we don't feel like the current system is helping us. But, the point I wanted to make to the students was this was battle, even though most of the vote, almost all the people voting were men, the battle was between women. And this is brought out if you go to downtown Tennessee, where you can see all the signs about, what happened in history back, the late 1910s.
And it was the vote. I mean, if Tennessee decided it, this was not a landslide in any one direction. This was something that was narrowly won.
It was the guy wore a red rose that day, but his mother had told him she had changed her mind, and she thought that women should get the right to vote. He still wore his red rose. He was a very young legislator, but at the very end, for the tie-breaking vote, he cast it for women to get the right to vote, and then he had to run for it while women with red roses were chasing after him for being a traitor.
You eat crawfish on us? Ah! Yeah,
Jay Morgan had fun with that.
That really is. That's how complicated these things are. I mean, it's great to have this wonderful intent of empowering women and creating safety for them. And look, I'm not in any way for female mutilation or any of those things, but I am for protecting the women that we go to help, because I know for a fact we go into villages, we cause up a ruckus that we can't see, and we leave. And there are women there paying the price for it. And if anything, we're causing more damage than good. So let's accept that there's going to be a lot of pain along the way, but the slow and deliberate process is much more important. Plus, a lot of these female teams also in the military are designed to gather intel and search people, which is a valid thing. But it also, again, you're fighting for what I call affects over effects. If you want to piss a bunch of people off, go in and start frisking all the women. You know, like, you've protected yourself that day, but you've also endangered yourself every day after that, and in every village around there. So if you want to create that affect, good job. You've pissed everybody
people
off.
This goes back to like learning from history. I mean, we don't understand why we have the Third Amendment, and keep in mind it's the Third Amendment thing that you won't have soldiers quartered in our homes. And most people, we love our military. We're like, yeah, we love the military. We wouldn't mind having someone stay in, just to help out. We'd be happy to donate to Paralyzed Veterans of America or Wounded Warriors or something like that, or veterans groups. We all love our work. What we don't realize is during that time, Britain was emptying out their prisons by getting people conscripted into military service, and then you're compelling colonists to take someone who is basically, a shock troop person, and then you're seeing, they maybe haven't seen a Revolutionary War era, cabin where everyone stays under one roof and in one big room. You don't have like these private rooms, and that's your wife and your daughter that you have with. I mean, even loyalists in New Jersey are like, up in arms over this thing. Look, we can't deal with this.
Yes.
You're getting some of the worst people in society. This is not a cross section of the professional soldier. This will terrify the colonists if we get these people.
Right. So let's wrap this thing up, because I've had you just for about an hour, and we've covered a lot of ground. So let's just backtrack real quick. Capsulize this for me. Lone wolf terrorists. Give me the 30-second answer on lone wolf terror.
Okay, sure. Most of them aren't lone wolves. They have a small sort of support network. We find out that most lone wolves are motivated by a traumatic change in society, especially for men. That's like a loss of job status. They tend to personalize their anger, by targeting people as opposed to property. With these small networks, it makes them easier to track. The literature that says that, well, these are just so random. They're almost like trying to stop lightning strikes. Who knows where it's going to strike? There are a couple clues left behind, and these small little networks are easier to penetrate than the solitary individual.
Should we be worried about terrorism here in the United States?
I would definitely worry about it, because, I mean, I don't think someone shooting up a Christmas party is going to overthrow the United States. But if we ignore the problem, if we don't try to catch it, don't try to stop it, don't try and police it, I mean, sooner or later we get one of those suitcase bombs smuggled in, or it's a dirty bomb, or it's a weapon of mass destruction that really would have a chance to not only, break our economy, but also, lead to the counter reaction that would create more terrorism and more such attacks.
Yeah, and like the attack today in Russia, if we had a complex attack, even with a limited yield as far as battle damage goes, it has a massive effect on that area and a big affect on the states in general.
Oh, it does. So, and because lots of people, that's how people get around, is through this public transportation. I know I've taken it. They're very crowded.
The prevention is painful. It's cancer. You're going to feel like crap. You're going to have horrible things happen. You're going to lose your hair. It may not all come back, and there's going to be pain. But if you don't deal with it, then the terrorism problem continues to get worse. Or you know what? Are you willing to make the bet of saying if we do nothing, terrorism won't matter? It's going to matter, so there has to be some kind of approach. I think that's fair to say. I've had you for an hour. I don't want to take any more time, because I know you're on spring break and trying to enjoy your time off. You have any closing comment for us at all, or anything else that you want to cover before we
thank you very much for your appearance for my students. They really liked it a lot, and they've talked about it. I think it had a big effect on them. It was one of our most crowded events, too, based on who you are and what your service is. And so continue to suggest doing that. I think that's something. And I told the students, I said, I'm not going to agree with Pete Turner on everything, but that's why I'm bringing him in. If I agreed with him on everything, I wouldn't bring him in, because I would just go on talking.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know we disagree on certain things, and that's all right, because the red rose and the white rose have to be out there to make us make hard decisions. And shoot, I don't know everything you know, and you don't know everything I know, and mixing those two things together teaches us both a little something. This is, again, John Tures from LaGarnge, and he is our new terrorism correspondent. He just got shanghaied into being our terrorism guy, and we'll definitely have you back on. Thank you so much, and we'll look forward to having you on again soon.
Okay, I appreciate it very much.